Hey everyone, my name's Jade, and today I'll be talking to you about the road to the American Civil War. Not only is this one of my history teacher's favorite topics, but it's also one of mine because it dealt so much with American values of equality and freedom. So, without further ado, let's get started. So today we're going to have three main objectives. The first one is to investigate for long-term and short-term causes of the Civil War. So in other words, what were the long-term problems that festered and boiled within the states before the Civil War, and what were the final straws that really set off the war? Second, we're going to explore the significance of important antebellum documents and bills. So what did the war look like on paper? And finally, we're going to draw our own conclusions based on the facts and analysis shown here. On the AP US history test, they didn't ask me to summarize history because the graders already know what went down. They want us to bring our own analysis to the table and draw our own conclusions based on what you've learned in the class. Let's start our story with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. You're probably thinking that that's 40 years before the Civil War started. How is this even relevant? But it's a really important piece of legislation because Congress strikes up a deal. Okay, well, that doesn't happen very often, but the contents of this deal are really important because first, it says that Missouri enters the Union as a slave state, Maine enters the Union as a free state, and it draws an imaginary line across the U.S. This is very important, so look at that picture and keep that in mind as we progress throughout the rest of this lesson. Since we're talking about drawing imaginary lines across stuff, let's talk about the Texas annexation. Mexican and U.S. relations were sort of a mess in the mid 19th century because Mexico insisted that the border of Texas lied on the Nueces River, whereas the U.S. claimed that it was on the Rio Grande. On December 29, 1845, Texas entered the U.S. as a slave state, and the territorial dispute set off the Mexican-American War. In 1846, the Wilmot Proviso was offered up by Congressman David Wilmot, and it proposed to forbid slavery in all new territories acquired from Mexico. So when the war ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Wilmot Proviso was implemented. The U.S. also took possession of California and New Mexico in what would become known as the Mexican Cession. Also, the Rio Grande became Texas's southern border. Acquiring this new territory only furthered the debate over the slavery question and deepened sectional tensions in the United States, a prelude to the Civil War. As a result of the 1848 Wilmot Proviso, we see the rise of the Free Soil Party, who believed that slavery should be banned in all new Western territories. Although many of the members of this party were abolitionists, many of them were also outright racists, who believed that blacks should not be allowed in the West. This is interesting because although most of the time third parties don't win presidential elections, it shows us that the opinions of Americans have always been and will always be on a spectrum. You can't organize it into specific little boxes. So with this time period, we don't see only abolitionists and slaveholders, we see everything in between. And later in the lesson, we'll see how those divisions impacted the political sphere, especially in the year of 1860. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brought a ton of people west, but with these migrants came their ideas and debates over slavery. Conflict sparked when the state of California drafted its state constitution that banned slavery in their state. President Zachary Taylor was actually in favor of this constitution, but opposition to the plan to admit New Mexico and California as free states sparked talks of secession from Southern radicals. A senator named Henry Clay proposed a compromise, shown here, that would later be known as the Compromise of 1850. Here were a couple of its points. First, California would enter the Union as a free state. The rest of the Mexican Cession would be divided into Utah and New Mexico territories. Settlers there would vote on slavery based on popular sovereignty. Third, the slave trade in Washington, D.C. would end. And fourth, the U.S. would adopt the Fugitive Slave Law, which decided that any plantation owner in the South could retrieve their escaped or stolen slaves in the North, provided that they brought along a witness. However, this law had a loophole. A lot of free northern blacks ended up being kidnapped because plantation owners could bribe someone to witness that so-and-so was their slave, even if they'd never seen them before in their life. Just let that sink in for a moment. Unfortunately, the Compromise of 1850 was a temporary solution to what became a permanent problem. With all the turmoil within the U.S., Civil war ended up being inevitable. So the Compromise of 1850 isn't really remembered as a stop to the conflict, but as a forerunner to the Civil War. By this point in time, American politics were dominated by one topic, and that was slavery. Popular sovereignty was no exception. This was the political doctrine that the people who live in an area should decide whether or not to allow slavery. It was popularized by Senator Stephen Douglas of the Democratic Party. Hold on to him because he becomes very important later on. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 created Nebraska and Kansas territories and set in place that settlers would be able to decide whether or not to allow slavery in their territories. This essentially repealed the Missouri Compromise since these territories were above the line drawn by the Missouri Compromise. Kansas and Nebraska should have been free states by default, but as you will see, this leads to a lot of conflict. Naturally, the Kansas Nebraska Act didn't sit too well with abolitionists and the people who'd originally agreed to the Missouri Compromise, and the Kansas Nebraska Act had two main effects. First, the Republican Party is born. The original party platform called for the repeal of the Kansas Nebraska Act and the Fugitive Slave Act. It was opposed to the spread of slavery, but not necessarily to the existence of it, although many members of the party were abolitionists. The second and far more fatal result was Bleeding Kansas, a set of guerrilla attacks that happened in Kansas over the voting that took place for whether or not to allow slavery. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri crossed into Kansas and drafted the Lecompton Constitution, which blatantly conflicted with the anti-slavery legislature that was in Topeka. Never mind the fact that Topeka was the state capital and therefore was really the legitimate piece of legislation to listen to. In 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked the town of Lawrence, which is close to Topeka and was originally established by anti-slavery settlers. A firm abolitionist named John Brown retaliated by attacking the town of Potawatomi Creek. Remember this guy here, seen in the picture, because he will appear again. If Bleeding Kansas wasn't bad enough, the U.S. hit another road bump, the Dred Scott Decision of 1857. Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri but was moved to Wisconsin for 2 years. When he returned to Missouri, he sued for his freedom. Dred Scott v. Sanford was taken to the Supreme Court, where the court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, decided against Scott. This bad decision had a lot of crappy rationale behind it, but the message was clear. Slaves are not people. This decision would become more fuel that sparked the Civil War. One minor adjustment to this drawing. There we go. So remember how I said Stephen Douglas would appear again? Well, here he is, with a guest appearance by Abraham Lincoln. These two guys were both campaigning for the same Senate seat in the U.S. Senate. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were held in 7 different towns in Illinois, and the main topic of argument was slavery. Although Douglas won the Senate re-election as a result of these debates, Lincoln became a lot more famous as a result, and he became a national figure in politics, which would help power him towards his presidential election in 1860. Besides crazy guy John Brown trying to start a slave riot down in Harper's Ferry, there weren't a whole lot of new developments in 1859, so we're just going to skip ahead to the election year of 1860. Our 4 candidates were Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, Abraham Lincoln, and John Bell. As you can see, America had split into 4 different political parties, making this election year very unique. But due to the fact that the Democrat votes were split up between 2 candidates, Abraham Lincoln's win was all it took for the South to secede. As the president who had promised to stop the spread of slavery, he ticked off a lot of Southerners. And as President Buchanan was finishing his term, he chose to ignore this not-so-minor issue of secession. Despite his best efforts, President Lincoln was unable to stop the war from happening, but I think of this as a sign. Yes, we had to go to war, and we lost more American lives than any other battle to this date, but we had to go to war to stop the injustice of slavery that had been going on in this country since its birth, and even before then. So, what this war teaches us is that as long as our hearts are in the right places and we know what we're fighting for, anything is possible. The great thing about history is that we learn from the mistakes of the past and apply it to our future. So, I hope you learned something today and you had a good time because I know I did. Thank you.